This is a review of Facilitating Language and Literacy Development, a Dual Language Perspective, a thesis by Jennifer Sykes-Vaughan, cited in December 2013, through the Department of Communicative Disorders at Wichita State University. This is a critique by Lauren Juice and Sam Weber. We will be discussing the article's methodology, findings, discussions, conclusions, as well as Sam and I's critiques and conclusions about this article.
In order to provide a background for talking about what happens at dual language immersion programs, the author first talks about the literature regarding language and literacy development from pre-linguistic stages to phonological awareness and literacy events. Then talks about how being bilingual has potential cognitive benefits as well as a social capital benefit, having those social and economic benefits over the lifetime. And then talks about how bilingual education has grown tremendously in the US, how there were only 30 programs in 1987, whereas in 2011 there were over 400 programs. And next she goes on to talk about the methodology as used in her master's thesis.
Methodology. The author conducted her research using 587 surveys sent out to parents for students at English-Spanish Dual Immersion School, Horace Mann Elementary in Wichita, Kansas. At this school, the population of students, 50% of them are native English speakers and 50% of them are native Spanish speakers. The survey was sent out in both English and in Spanish. The survey included 5 questions relating to how parents facilitate language and literacy development in their child and how they help their children with homework. The survey questions are as follows. What is the primary language? I help my child with home English, Spanish. Circle 1. When I can't help my child with homework, school projects, I most often ask their teacher for help, find another student to help them, look for help on the internet, or other. What activities are used to facilitate language literacy learning in the primary home language? Check all that apply. Read books, music, play board games, play computer games, watch movies or TV shows, attend organized school functions, attend community events, or other. The last question is, to help my child learn in the second language, please check all they apply. And those are the same questions that were based for question number 4. There was a follow-up interview conducted with 10 parents who willingly participated in the survey. The breakdown of those interviews are as follows. 7 Spanish primary families, 2 English primary families, and 1 identified as a bilingual family.
Of the 587 questionnaires, 249 were returned, where the parents listed what they most did to develop language and literacy in both the L1 and L2 for their children. Reading ranked highest for both groups in developing both L1 and L2. Music, movies, and TV also ranked high for both groups, particularly in developing their children's L1. One difference that they found was that English proficient parents often looked outward for outside events such as school functions or community events in order to develop their child's L2, whereas Spanish proficient parents typically looked inward for activities such as TV, music, movies in order to develop their English skills.
Author's discussion. From the 249 returned surveys, the author wanted to find similarities and differences from questions 4 and 5 from all parents who responded to the survey. The author discussed areas in which parents' responses were similar. The top 2 choices for questions 4 and 5 for the L1 were commonly reading books and speaking the L1 at home for facilitating language development in the first language, as well as discussing how they were different. English primary parents looking to school for language 2 development and Spanish primary parents looking to media, TVs, movies, or music for language 2 development. So that was a way that the parents differed in the activities that they used to foster the secondary language at home. The author also looked at inherent differences between and among the two different groups surveyed, the English primary and the Spanish primary. There was a very distinct difference on reasons parents chose Horace Mann, the role of the neighborhood school, and parental involvement. So what types of parents were going to be involved in the school systems, as well as facilitating those carryover languages at home. Also, the academic performance of all of the students at Horace Mann Elementary School are reviewed. This showed that the Horace Mann students performed better than school districts and on par with state schools when looking at testing.
The author finishes by talking about how the parents' intentional and unintentional interactions with their children help to develop their child's both L1 and L2. She also talks about how both Spanish proficient and English proficient parents viewed books as a very important resource to developing both languages, and talked about how parents were willing to support their children in dual language programs like this Horace Mann Elementary School because their children are meeting or exceeding the state academic standards as well as learning a second language.
Lauren's critique of the article. The first critique is that the author only retained 42% of surveys and then followed up with an in-person interview of only 10 families. Of those interviews, the families that were represented were 7 Spanish primary families, 2 English primary families, and 1 bilingual English-Spanish family. This does not seem like a true representation of the information or demographics of the school in which they were originally surveying. It was stated that 50% of the students were English primary and 50% were Spanish primary, so I would have liked to see in the follow-up interview that the 10 families were split evenly based on the demographics of the school. The second critique was the breakdown of the methodology did not show the percentage of how long the children had been exposed to the second language. Could that have had an impact on the strategies or concerns the parents had? Some parents may have learned certain strategies and been continuing to use that strategies from kindergarten, versus some parents are learning new strategies because their child is learning the second language at a later time in their elementary school career. What I felt was overlooked in this article was what was the educational level of the parents, and did that impact the strategy used in implementation of literacy strategies for their children. I feel like parents who understand that language development occurs over a long period of time, as well as those who have more resources, might have implemented different strategies than parents who are not aware or have the means to provide those resources or strategies for their child at home. And also, the second thing I believe was overlooked were there any children with speech and language disorders that were represented in the collection of surveys, and would that have had an impact on the strategies that parents used? Or were there strategies that potentially those students were receiving from outside sources, resource, speech and language therapy, as well as potentially a tutor at home? So those were the things I felt like should be covered in this article that I did not see.
Some critiques that I had after reading the article. Reading was at the top of the list on the questionnaire for activities that the parents did to stimulate L1 and L2. And the top of the list is, of course, going to look like the best option, and parents don't want to mark that they're doing something that's not the best. Also, the category of TV, music, and movies wasn't really a well-defined category. I mean, I'm sure all families listen to and watch these things, but they may not be very purposeful activities for stimulating a child's language. Also, since responses were voluntary, only the parents who may be more involved were the ones taken into consideration. What was overlooked in this study? Well, Horace Mann School should really be compared with other schools of choice and not to the neighborhood schools in the district when looking at the children's academic performance. And also, the study left out information about the parents as well as the students' relative proficiencies in both their L1 and L2, and I think that could have a huge impact on strategies used for language development. And the author also left out information on the parents' education level, which could have had correlations with language development strategy use.
Comparison of our critiques. Sam and I both had some similarities and differences in how we broke down our critiques of this article. Our similarities of the critiques were that both of us looked at a lack of 50% voluntary response rate could potentially be a problematic factor that could impact the findings of the study. We were both critical of the author's decision to exclude information on language proficiencies in either language, as well as the amount of exposure to L1 and L2, and how that could also impact the different strategy uses at home. Lastly, we were also critical of how the author neglected to discuss the parents' level of education and the effect that information could have on the findings of the research of the strategies implemented at home. Sam and I only had a few differences in our critiques. I critiqued the author for having a small, unrepresentative sample for the interview portion of the study, which I felt like didn't show the true demographics of the school's population. And I was also critical of the author's choice to overlook how parental involvement and use of language literacy may have impacted academic performance, as well as my critique of the lack of awareness of whether any of the students may have had a speech and language disorder that could have impacted the findings as well. Sam would have liked to see the school's performance compared to other schools of choice rather than the neighborhood schools in the district. He feels as though that would be more of a normative sample since the school was a school of choice versus compared to the regular public schools around them. He also wanted to see the questioner choices for how parents intervened better defined and more precise, and the thought out in terms of their placement on the list. He felt as though that the placement of the questions on the list were too broad, as well as feeling as though some of the parents may have checked just the first answer, since it was very common since the first answer was often the item that was checked on the list, and that should be also discussed in her readings.
Overall, Vaughn's findings were that parental interactions are important for stimulating both L1 and L2 in their children. Books, TV, movies, music, school functions were all listed as very stimulating activities for both L1 and L2 by Spanish-speaking as well as English-speaking parents. We found that the author's conclusions are logical, but that further studies should look to replicate these findings with less biased sampling and interviewing procedures in order to strengthen the arguments that Vaughn makes. And lastly, the study is targeting a really important area, which is parental involvement and strategies for dual language learning. However, the author should have considered larger sample size, comparison to more similar schools, and precise descriptions in the survey in order to get more reliable results.